The following program is brought to you by the Center for Educational Outreach at Baylor College of Medicine.
I'm a senior lecturer in the School of Engineering at Rice University. I teach professional communication, and it's true, approximately 15 years ago, I was working here with Barbara and her colleagues at Baylor. I really enjoyed working in educational outreach. The only reason that I went back to Rice was because I missed contact with students. And at Rice, I actually have not only do professional development for our faculty, but I also work directly with students in engineering. And I love what I do, and I'm glad to be here today to share it with you. So why is it that leadership and communication skills are so important? Well, it's primarily because a leader's effectiveness is most evident or visible when he or she is presenting orally. Right? And a recent prominent example of this that comes to mind is Sarah Palin. If you think back to the Republican National Convention, maybe you watched it, Sarah gave, in my opinion, a blockbuster speech. And as a result of that speech, she really garnered a lot of support, and she changed the momentum of the campaign. But within a few days of that fantastic performance, she started having to speak in an impromptu fashion to the press and at rallies. And her performance in that particular interaction wasn't strong. And it actually eroded the credibility she had built up at the convention. And it altered people's perception of her as a competent leader. Right? So you should not underestimate the importance of having exemplary oral communication skills. And in fact, leaders in studies spend 70 to 90% of their time communicating either in formal presentations or informally in conversations. So they spend an exorbitant amount of their time communicating. So it's through speeches and presentations that leaders establish definitions and meaning for their own actions and give others a sense of what the organization is about. And in addition to defining an organization's culture and values, communication is what enables organizations and individuals to improve performance. Right? Communication is how we establish rapport with one another. It's how we share information. It's how we solve problems more efficiently. And it's how we share our enthusiasm and excitement for what we do with other people. So it's imperative that you master public speaking skills. And how do you do this? The 3 P's of public speaking. And those are planning, preparing, and presenting. And by planning, I mean developing a communication strategy, analyzing your audience, and organizing a compelling argument. By prepare, you develop content to support key points. You create PowerPoint slides to support your message. You test the flow of the logic in the material that you've planned. And you practice. And then you actually have to perform, right? You have to channel all that anxiety in a positive direction. You want to deliver with confidence, handle the Q&A effectively, right? There are times when someone can give a very well-prepared extemporaneous talk, but then they fumble in the Q&A in the way that I referred to Sarah Palin earlier, right? And the Q&A is where your knowledge gets tested, so you want to be really prepared for the Q&A. And then last, self-reflection is important to improvement, right? What did you do well? Where could you stand to improve in the future? So this slide represents an overview of the material I'll be presenting in the next few days. And today I'm going to focus explicitly on planning and preparing. And when I come back, we're going to focus exclusively on delivery skills, and it will be very interactive. But today it will be mostly lecture. So I'd like to look at these in a little bit more detail, beginning with planning. And the first step of planning is developing a communication strategy. It's very tactical. In business, by communication strategy, we simply refer to what are your goals and how do you develop a plan to achieve them. In communication, the emphasis really shifts to audience. Right? Who is your particular audience? So deciding what your purpose is in communicating with a particular audience and selecting the best way to reach that audience to achieve a purpose. And I know we're talking here in the abstract, so I'm going to try to make this more concrete for you. This emphasizes audience and purpose, but people don't communicate in a vacuum, right? They communicate in a specific context or situation. So if you look at this slide, you see that the box on the outside is context, right? It's the big picture. So when you approach any kind of speaking engagement, first start analyzing the context. Questions you might ask yourself are, what's going on in the world or in my nation, in my institution, my school, in my department that is going to affect how my message is received? And what's the big context here? Where does this particular presentation fall along a continuum of interactions? Meaning, is this the first time you have gone back to your school to introduce a new idea? Is it the first time you've met with this group to solve a problem related to a program that you may have initiated? Is it the final wrap on a program that's been really successful? Like, where does this fall along a continuum of activities? And what impact is it likely to have on the receivers of the message? Then you want to think in terms of your strategic objectives, your purposes, and I'll go into that in more detail in a minute. Spokesperson, who's the best person to carry the message to the audience? Is it you? If not you, then who? Do you have your core message identified? What's the best medium for that message? Is it the kind of extemporaneous presentation I'm giving today, a prepared talk? Is it a round table, a little bit less formal, where you have more documentation in your hands? Is it a teleconference? What's the best media to communicate? And last, audience. Right? Who's your primary audience? Who's your secondary audience? And even though audience is at the bottom of that pyramid, that's not indicative of its importance. Right? I put it at the bottom of the pyramid because audience actually informs all of the other decisions that you make. And that's why you have that big red arrow that connects back to the top. So I mentioned you have to define your objectives. So in a very general sense, most presentations that you might give involve informing, right, sharing information. There may be some elements of persuasion. Maybe you want to convince your colleagues to take some kind of action or to recommend something that you've suggested. You might be establishing your credibility if you are new to a department or a school, or enhancing it if you're taking on a leadership role within a particular division. So you want to think concretely about purpose, and I'm going to ask you to go even more specific than that. Okay, when you're thinking about your talk and planning it, because you're going to be giving talks in this workshop at the end of the week, there are 3 questions I want you to answer when you're defining your objectives. And those are: 1, when I'm finished speaking, I want the audience to remember X. And I want you to fill in that X very concretely. If you gave your audience a quiz 3 days after your talk, what should they remember? 2nd, when I'm through speaking, I want my audience to do Y. Right? What kind of action do you want for them to take based on your presentation? And finally, the 3rd question, when I'm through speaking, I want my audience to feel Z, right? Fill in that blank. And you might think, feel, right? This is an academic talk to my colleagues. What do feelings have to do with it? But any kind of speaking in which you want to persuade someone to do something involves connecting with them On some kind of emotional level, you might want your audience to feel concerned about a problem. You might want your audience to feel really excited to use a new resource that you're introducing. How do you want them to feel? So those 3 questions you should answer in defining your strategic objectives. And then audience. I mentioned audience is at the foundation of all that you do, right? And I said that you should have a primary audience. Usually that's some kind of decision maker. It might be a few decision makers, maybe district representatives. It might be the senior administration at your school, a department head. But don't overlook secondary audiences, because secondary audiences can exert influence on decision makers. And those might be your colleagues in your department. They might be students, parents, right? There are lots of people who can influence decision makers. So once you think about who the various stakeholders are, ask yourself, why are they interested in what I have to offer? Or why should they be interested? What do they already know? Another question you might ask yourself is, what do they think they know, but maybe don't know? How did they acquire that knowledge? In other words, is their training similar to yours? Is it very different? Maybe you have a lot of certifications in science teaching, but some of your colleagues are new to the field and less experienced. Like, how does their training compare to yours? What criteria do they use to make decisions, right, when we're talking about that decision maker in terms of supporting a plan? And once you've analyzed your audience, it's time to identify your key points for a talk. And in most talks, you can't convey more than about 3 key points in 20 minutes. Anywhere from 0 to 20 minutes, 3 points, key points is about your maximum. More than that, and you're going to tax your audience's short-term memory. If you have 50 minutes to an hour, you might get by with 3 to 5. But up to 20 minutes, 3 points is about it. So you want to think about what those key points are and group them. And one strategy I find helpful is creating a pyramid. Right, this is just a tree structure, and this is an abstraction. I'll give you another example that's fleshed out in a minute. But you want your main claim or thesis at the top where it says overall argument. Then you have 3 sub-arguments. Those would be your key points, and then evidence to support the key points. And there are a few features I want to point out about this tree, and that is that the sub-arguments summarize the information that's below. Okay, so the high-level idea always summarizes what's below it. There's no overlap between the sub-arguments. And the other thing I want you to notice is that in this tree, the evidence is balanced, meaning I don't have 6 kinds of evidence coming off sub-argument 1 and 2 off the other 2, right? Because that would create a sense of imbalance in my argument. One aspect of my argument would be getting a whole lot of emphasis and time, and the others would not. So in your tree, you want to create some balance. And then here's an example, fleshed out. The main claim, the City of Houston should provide incentives for installing green roofs on commercial buildings. And I can elaborate. To cut energy costs, to decrease water runoff, and reduce pollution. Right? That one sentence covers my main claim and my key points that I'll go on to develop in my talk. So once you've grouped your ideas, you have to think about what order to place them in. Right? That's an organizational structure. Some of the common structures are chronology, inductive, deductive, problem solution, cause and effect. And 2 strategies that I often see used that don't work very well are chronological sequential narratives and inductive organization. So for a chronological narrative, imagine you're going back to your school to present the website that you've been introduced to during this program. And how would a chronological presentation go? How would that kind of talk go? What would you say first? Well, the first thing I did was go to the program, and there, right, I went to this URL and I logged in this way. Exactly. This sort of sequential process, which is how we organize our own experiences, but it's not necessarily the best way to present it to an audience. I mean, certainly it is if you're trying to teach a process that's sequential, but when you're trying to introduce people to a resource, it's not the best way to do it. Second is inductive. Anybody know what I mean by inductive organization? It starts out with specific sort of evidence and details, and it builds to the main claim. So in this case, somebody's presenting evidence for each sub-argument, and then at the end, they get to the main point. It's sort of like a suspense novel. And again, there are appropriate times to use inductive organization for suspense, for example, but in most extemporaneous talks, it's not a good idea. And I'm going to show you why. So here's an example. This is a research talk that I recently attended, and the title slide said nanomedicine. This is a huge area of research, so that title's not very informative. I have no idea where the talk is going. And the speaker gets up and says, so today I'm going to talk about nanomedicine. Like, well, we're just all there to listen. Then the speaker starts putting up 3 slides about nanoshells. One has to do with their properties, they're biocompatible. Then another slide about how you can tune their wavelengths to manipulate them. And I'm like holding this information about nanoshells in my head, but I don't really know why, right? And then they start introducing a whole series of slides about a hydrogel polymer that it too is biocompatible, and here's the chemical formula for it. And then they get about 18 minutes into the talk to their results, and they say, we're coating these nanoshells with this polymer, and this is how they behave. So they start showing us some data, and you're thinking, okay, great. And then in the conclusion slide, the guy says, we're coating nanoshells with a hydrogel polymer to deliver insulin in a non-invasive way in diabetes patients. And you're like, wow, cool idea. Who knew? Right? You didn't know. All the audience is just sitting there pulling in all this background information and vocabulary, but you have no idea that that's the purpose until the very end. And it places a huge burden on your audience to organize that way. Right? Most U.S. audiences prefer a direct bottom line approach where the key point is up front. Many of you have undoubtedly heard that adage, when you're giving a talk, tell them what you're going to tell them, then tell them what you told them. That's a deductive form of organization. So imagine, you start off with the main claim and you build down instead, right? The arrowhead directions have changed on this one. And just to show you how that same talk could be reorganized with just a little tweaking to the front end. Imagine instead that same speaker stood up and said, 20 million people in the U.S. suffer from diabetes. And many diabetics use insulin injections to regulate their glucose. And injections are uncomfortable, it's a needle prick, they're not that sanitary, it's inconvenient to travel with all that paraphernalia. Our lab has developed an innovative approach by which we coat nanoshells with a hydrogel polymer to deliver insulin in a non-invasive way. And in this talk, I'm going to tell you about nanoshells and the polymer we're using and show you some preliminary data that looks really promising. Boom, they're off. Right? The rest of the talk from that point on is the same. Right? They go through the same slides. All that changed was the beginning. But that's a deductive approach to organization where you push your key point up front early and forecast where you're going. And the audience needs that kind of repetition. Any questions so far about planning? Nope. So once you have your key points in mind and you've thought about the organizational structure, It's time to start developing some content. And keep in mind that when it comes to content in general, less is more. Right? You want to choose things that are relevant and specifically focused on your key points that you're trying to make. You want a good balance of general with specific. There shouldn't be anything in your talk where the audience goes, "Why is this here?" Or "So what?" Right? Nothing irrelevant. Everything should contribute to the key point. How many of you are experienced at presenting data? A couple hands went up. I bring this up because in some arguments, particular audiences respond well to quantitative data or evidence, particularly scientists and engineers. And in my experience, this is something that people struggle with when they're giving a talk, is how to talk their way through a table or a graph effectively. And I was working with a computer scientist who had this really great 4-step process that I think is worth mentioning if you find yourself in a position to present data. And that is, lead off when you bring up a slide that has a graph on it of some sort. Lead off with what question does that figure answer? Second, describe the graph, right? What are the axes? What do the colored lines represent? Describe the data. Then report the result. And what most people leave off is the last part. That's actually interpreting the result. So what does it mean? They just report the result and assume that everybody comes to the same interpretation. But that's just not true. You need to tell people what they're supposed to get out of the data. So for example, I did a survey in a bioengineering course where we introduced CPR, Calibrated Peer Review. It's a free software tool that enables peer review electronically. And we asked students who had participated in this curriculum program to rate how their participation affected the ability to evaluate and critique a technical poster. And what you see here is a bar chart of the students' responses. And you have the responses where either it diminished their ability, no change, improved a little, or improved a lot. And as you can see, 97% of the students reported that it improved their ability to some extent. And my colleague and I were surprised by this result. We didn't expect it to be so high. But what we found is that most of our students had no prior experience evaluating posters. And so some experience represented an improvement to them. Right? So in that last sense, I just tried to interpret our finding. I didn't just say 97% reported that improved, right? I went on to try to account for it. So this is a nice sequence, I think, for presenting tables and figures. Now, you can put together a great empirical argument, but the fact of the matter is the audience is not always paying attention to the great evidence that you've amassed in your argument. And what studies of audience attention show is that over the course of a 20-minute talk, what do you think happens from minute 0 to 3? You have it there on your handout, right? There's an upward trajectory. People show up to a talk hoping to learn something. They're a little bit excited. And then for the middle of the talk, it's peaks and valleys. Right? People tend to tune in for key points, and then they tune out for the details. And then if somebody is smart enough to send a cue, like in summary or to wrap up, what happens? Everybody tunes in, right? Perks up. It's like, oh, this is almost over. And surely in the conclusions, they'll tell me what the key points are, so I should listen now, right? And sure enough, there's a spike in attention. And what this simplification of a graph shows is that you want to exploit the opportunity at the beginning of the talk and the end of the talk to convey your key points and connect. That's my point in showing this graph to you, that people are with you at the beginning and the end, and in the middle, it's touch and go. So when you're planning and preparing your talk, you want to be sure to start strong and end strong. Now, I've already mentioned that in my diabetes example, in the opening of that talk, you want to motivate people's interest. I did that by explaining how many people have diabetes, the kind of problem they have with injections. State your key points. Preview the topics that are going to be covered. And you want to establish your credibility by the way you deliver. And we'll focus more on leadership presence tomorrow. A couple of things not to do. Don't stand up and apologize. Don't stand up and say something like, I wish I'd had more time to prepare. Like, that is such a downer as an audience member. We all wish we had more time to prepare, but don't confess that at the opening of your talk. Or don't get up and say, oh, I really hate public speaking. Right? Talk about undermining your credibility. But I see this happen all the time. When you get to the conclusion, the key things to do, you want to make sure that you restate your key points after you send a cue. You want to be very explicit if you want people to take action. Don't just leave people hanging. I can't tell you how many business presentations I've had where they're trying to get funding and they get to the end and they very eloquently wrap up the advantages of their proposal, but they don't ask for the money. Right? You have to go forward, and you don't have to be crude about it in the way that I just was. You can say, and we invite your support, right? Something that says, we want you to do something. But so few people take that next step. A couple of things not to do in the conclusion. One is, it's not the time to introduce information that you maybe forgot to mention in your talk. So, for example, oh, back on that third graph, I forgot to tell you that da-da-da-da-da. Right? Not a good idea. It's not the time to end with a flat, that's all I have for you. Oh, how many of you have seen that? People get to the end, and I think speakers have a tendency to rush the conclusion a little bit. I don't know if it's because they're getting anxious to be done or nervous about the Q&A starting. And so they sort of swiftly rush through their conclusions, and then they pause, and they know that they're done, but the audience doesn't know that they're done because the pace was off. And so they just sort of shrug and say, that's it. It's like, oh, God. Okay, and last, and this is a pet peeve of mine, but how many of you have seen the talk that concludes and then has the question slide after it with like the word art dude? Questions. How many of you have seen that? I see people nodding. Okay. This is a very poor rhetorical move for a speaker. Why is that? Because the audience is always a little bit behind you. Always. And so if you move through your conclusions and then you quickly remove the visual and you put up a blank slide that says questions on it, you're taking away the material they have to form questions and comments. You want to leave that up there and just invite people to ask questions. And you don't want the slide to do the inviting. If you need to acknowledge sources of support after your conclusions, then what I recommend is that you have your conclusion slide, and then you put up your acknowledgments and you thank the people you need to thank or the funding agents. And then duplicate your conclusion slide and bring it back up. And you don't have to announce that you're doing it. Oh, I'm bringing up my conclusion slide so you guys can ask me questions. Or you don't have to say that. You just silently advance the slide and you say, and now I'd like to take your questions and comments. And that's it. So you want to make sure that you plan the intro and the conclusion well. And I have a handout that I'll send around about ways to motivate interest. There are examples on this page that I'm not going to go into. You can read them later. Ways to get people engaged or to provide an anecdote. I use some statistics at the beginning of my talk to get you thinking about it, and a prominent example of Sarah Palin that I thought you might recall. But this has a whole list of ways to motivate the audience's interest in your material. Okay, one other thing not to do. Wow, nothing I think is more overwhelming than someone who has the title slide up and then puts up an agenda slide that looks like a laundry list. I feel tired just on the second slide, and I'm not even interested yet, right? They haven't even motivated yet. All they've done is said the title of their talk and said, these are the 15 things I'm going to talk about in the next 10 minutes. It's like, right? An agenda slide is helpful for previewing, but you really should be very thoughtful in choosing the key topics that you want to forecast in advance. So no to the version on the left and yes to the version on the right. So I mentioned that in the middle of a talk it can be touch and go. The audience might be with you, they might tune out. And one way to keep them with you is by crafting really strong transitions. And transitions are the logical glue in a talk. The transitions from section to section and from slide to slide. That's what I'm referring to here. And for most presenters, they don't spend a lot of time refining transitions because that's something you can only do at the very end of your preparation stage, pardon me. And as a result, they come up with these really weak transitions. You've seen someone, they advance the slide and they read their own title, oh, results. Or they'll say next. Or they say another thing 20 times in a row. Another thing, another thing, another thing. Right? And what I want you to keep in mind is that the logic that informs the talk is there. Right? The person who sat down and prepared the talk understands why the points on a slide are in a particular order, why the slides are ordered in the particular way. But you have to make that logic explicit to the audience. And you usually can only do that by practicing out loud and you actually going through and verbalizing, articulating how you're going to get out of the last point on one slide and into the first point on the next slide. But for me, this represents the difference between a good talk and a great talk. Solid transitions. And in this week, you all will be presenting as a team, in teams of 4. So I thought it would be helpful if I just mentioned a few aspects of team presentations for you to keep in mind. And that is, in advance, determine roles, right? Who's going to be talking about once, who's introducing everything at the beginning, who's wrapping things up at the end. Be sure that you introduce all the team members at the beginning. Plan those transitions, those handoffs from speaker to speaker. Now that I've explained the purpose of the website, Barbara is going to take us through the pages that relate to assessment, right? That's what I mean by planning the speaker transitions. You have to watch time carefully, and I would urge you to practice once or twice as a team to make sure that you get your timing right. Answer questions as a team, not just one person. Because the whole team dynamic is important, not just the delegation and partitioning of the tasks, but a real sense of team unity and coherence is important. So when it's time for the Q&A, you don't want one person hanging out over here by the door, pressed up against the wall, and somebody else front center fielding all the questions. Right? That's a poor team dynamic. Or you don't want somebody standing up in the front but just kind of looking up at the ceiling. I once had a kid in a class who was like dorking with the laser pointer on the ceiling while his colleague was answering questions. Right? I don't mean to suggest that you would do something like that, but you want to be looking at the person on your team who's speaking like they're saying something interesting and you've never heard it before. Right? Because that's part of the whole ethos that your team is establishing. Any questions about preparing? Because at this point I've talked about planning and preparing, and I wanted to spend some time really switch gears and talk about slide design. So any questions before we go on to that?